Hey everyone, welcome to the Journey Home podcast. And we are continuing today in our study of the book of Galatians. Today we're going to look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. So, just as a reminder, again, we are in the part of the letter now that I guess most people would call the practical portion of the letter or the pastoral exhortation or whatever label you want to put on it. But it's the part where Paul is just giving instruction to the church on just how to live as a gospel community, right? And, I've said it before, but it's always worth repeating. It's so critical that we don't separate, these quote unquote more practical sections from the earlier parts of the letter where Paul's really unpacking the truth of what God has done for us, who God is, what God is like. He usually starts his letters with that and then finishes it with the more practical exhortations. But again, it's so critical that we don't just, turn to the latter half of the letter, read the instructions, and then go off and try to do that in our own strength, because what will happen is then that will effectively become a new law for us, right? And so and then slowly what over time what ends up happening is without realizing it, we start trying to live according to the law or according to our flesh, and we try to do it in our own strength. But again, the power of of the gospel, and really what I have found is the secret to living a gospel centered life, is that everything we do in response or out of in light of who he is and what he has done. And so it's not about us trying to be good, but it's rather living in response to his goodness, right? We can so easily read that list at the end of chapter 5, right? The fruit of the Spirit, and just think, yeah, like I am not very loving, or I wasn't very loving today or yesterday or this month or this year, or I haven't been very joyful. I haven't been very peaceful, right? Or I haven't been very kind. And we can just go off and try again in our own strength to try to be more loving, try to be more patient, try to be more kind, right? And again, that's I totally get it. It's totally understandable, but that's not the gospel. That's not the power of the gospel. Um, Again, it's not about us trying to be good. It's living in response to his goodness. It's not about us being kind. It's about us living in response to his kindness. It's not about us being patient. It's about us, you know, living in response to his patience, his unbelievable patience toward us, and so um yeah, it's not about us trying to perform or us trying to get it right. It's understanding that he is the only one who's perfect. He's the only one who's gotten it right, and he gives us that perfection. He gives us all of that as a free gift. We just have to receive it and then live our lives in response to it. Okay. Um, and that's so important because, I've experienced this. I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where you just try, again, just to grit your teeth and muster up all the discipline you can and try to live, do all the right things that a good, quote unquote, good Christian should do, and you just try to restrain those bad impulses and try to you know muster up the best impulses that are in you. But at the end of the day, you realize it falls short, and at a certain point you will burn out, and you'll be so frustrated because you have a sense of what God's called you. You have a sense of what God has given you, and yet you feel so far removed from it, right? um, but see, that's what happens when we try to do it in our own strength, and it kind of becomes a new law to us, is that it ends in futility. Remember, Paul's one of his main points in this letter is that the law does not have the ability to produce righteousness in us. It doesn't have the ability to save us. Um, and so we need to always, stay connected. We always need to be reminded. We always have to keep in view his his mercies, his kindness, his grace, which is the gospel message. And so Paul's really giving us a picture of, again, after he's unpacked it, he's starting to give us a picture in the latter portion of this letter, um, of what the spirit-filled life looks like. And I talked about it last week. It's not just gifts of the Spirit. It's not just having these charismatic or Pentecostal experiences or expressions of faith. It's there's certain fruit. There are certain characteristics that will mark the life of the person who has truly encountered the grace of God, who has truly been transformed by the grace of God. There are certain fruit, which we know as the fruit of the Spirit, right? And so, if we see love, joy, and peace, and patience, and kindness, and goodness, gentleness, self-control, faithfulness, if we see these things growing and increasing in our lives, that is a good indicator that we're on the right path, that the gospel has laid a hold of us and is continuing to lay hold of our hearts day by day by day. And in contrast, if we see the fruit of the flesh or the works of the flesh, taking hold of us, and again, we're all vulnerable to it. It's not like that we're never going to be tempted or never going to make a mistake, right? But if we see those things truly laying hold of us and growing and increasing, that is a sign that, maybe we've missed the path a little bit, right? And we just have to turn around and get back on the right path. That's what repentance, that's one definition of repentance, right? And so, we can, again, Paul's giving us a picture of what that life can and should look like, right? And so as we continue into chapter 6, he's continuing along that vein, and he's really giving us a picture of what a spirit-filled community looks like, right? I just think it's so interesting, even in chapter 5, like every as he makes these pretty amazing statements, he'll turn right around and give us a warning, right? And so just an example is in chapter 5, verse 14, he says, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, love your neighbor as yourself." So that seems pretty straightforward, right? But then right away he gives us a warning. If you bite and devour one another, watch out, or you will be consumed by one another. And so I think I noted in one of the previous episodes that it's just understood, I think, in the New Testament, that our faith is meant to be expressed in community. Of course, there are individual aspects of it and expressions of it, but you just cannot get around community. And I know, especially in Western society and in the United States, we're such an individualistic society that we can, and I think in some ways we have, turned our faith into just purely an individual expression with no communal ramifications. But, when you read the New Testament, you cannot escape from the fact that, it's both, and it's not one or the other, and maybe for some of you that's obvious, but for people like me, I'm an introvert. I can easily go days and even weeks, just without people around, and I can feel like I'm doing fine, but according to the scriptures, I'm not. If I am not living out my faith in community, among other believers, then I'm not being faithful to all that Jesus commanded, right? And so, I just think it's interesting how, Paul gives the positive, vision of what life should look like. It's loving our neighbor as ourself, right? That's what it looks like for the person who is walking by the Spirit. But if you're not walking by the Spirit, what happens is we end up biting and devouring one another and ultimately consuming one another. So that's a pretty sober warning, right? And then you continue down to the end of chapter 5, verse 24, or verse 25. He says, "If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit." So again, calling us to walk by the Spirit. But then right away, verse 26, he says, Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another." And so you see the both the positive and the negative, right, of what life can look like. We can walk in step with the Spirit and love our neighbor, or we can um, just be envious of one another, or provoking one another, and or become conceited, right? And so, as Paul continues these thoughts in chapter 6, again, he is again, it's not a comprehensive list, but he's giving us some idea, some vision of what the spirit filled community looks like, of what the gospel centered community looks like. And the one that he writes about specifically here, he says, brothers and sisters, this is verse 1 of chapter 6. If someone is overtaken in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so that you also won't be tempted. And so, according to Paul, one of the things that should mark the spirit filled believer and the spirit filled community is that it should be a place where someone who is overtaken in any wrongdoing can be restored. And I don't know what your experience has been in church. And again, I'm not here to be critical of the church, but again, we have to um, we can't deny that the church isn't always a place that could be described that way, right? Maybe your experience has been different, and if so, praise God. But in my experience, I don't think the church. Now, of course, the church has done amazing things, so I'm not saying it's all bad. But you know, by and large, I don't know how good a job we do restoring people when they fall into sin, right? Which I think is, another way we could say, is, being overtaken in wrongdoing, right? And let me get a little more specific, right? Like, I think we all, like, the church is good at celebrating the story of the person who just got saved, right? And so, we hear about their life before Christ, and it can be sinful, it could be even super scandalous, but we rejoice that that person has now made the decision to put their faith in Jesus, right? And turn from their sin. And that, I think, the church is good at celebrating, right? In my experience, that's fine. That's great, right? But what about the person who's been walking with the Lord for many years faithfully, and then somehow at some point gets caught up, gets overtaken in wrongdoing, right? And just to be clear, I'm not saying that we don't, call that person to repentance, hold them accountable, and all those things. But, I think it's so easy for us to just turn our back on those people. And just to be clear, I'm including myself in this conversation. I don't know that I have the answer or that I've done it so well myself. But what I do know is, at least according to the Apostle Paul, that's what we're called to be as a community. We're called to help restore, those who are overtaken in wrongdoing, and, think about people that who have, you know, backslidden, or whatever language you want to use, fallen into sin, and whether they're pastors, or they're just, they're elders, or they're just, they're just a Christian, they're just a saint of God, and they get overtaken. That does happen. We cannot deny that that is possible and that it does happen. I know sometimes we want to just search for the easy explanation, like, oh, that person must have never been saved, or they were just a phony, or they were a hypocrite. Now, of course, that can be a possibility, sure. But I don't think that's always the answer. I think sometimes there are people who are genuine believers who love God, and for a number of reasons, they can get caught in wrongdoing. They can get caught back up in a sinful pattern, or an addiction, or, just whatever. I know that I'm capable of that, and hopefully you have the humility to recognize that you are also capable of that. Of course, we don't wish that upon anyone, but we have to understand that it can happen. And But if you think about it, like, doesn't it make sense? If we are truly saved by the grace of God, then shouldn't we be a community that's marked by grace, right? Like, shouldn't we be willing to extend grace to those who have fallen? Shouldn't we be willing to do the hard work to help restore someone who's fallen? Okay. Now, just to be clear, I know that there are all kinds of caveats that I should be issuing, and Paul issues some of them, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But I just want to start by making this overall point, that of what Paul is calling to us and what he's telling us is one major sign or one major characteristic of a gospel-centered community is that we should be able to restore such a person with a gentle spirit, right? I've seen, church discipline or supposed church discipline that was very harsh, right? And I've seen church discipline that was done with a gentle spirit. There is a big difference, okay? Okay, so here comes some of the caveats, right? So one of them, and this might not even be a complete list, but, Paul says, watching out for yourself so that you also won't be tempted. So there is wisdom, right? Not everyone is going to be in a position to respond to every kind of situation, right? And so, again, my point of being a community that, that is able to restore, that doesn't mean that every single person is qualified to do that or should be involved in that. Like, just for an example, if someone is caught up in alcoholism, right? Like maybe it's not wisdom to send someone else who's also struggling with that same addiction. Now, again, if they have a long track record of overcoming, then maybe they are the right person. But I'm saying, like, maybe not someone who is still struggling right at this moment, right? Like, that's just one example, but you get what I'm saying. There is wisdom in terms of who can, or who should be participating in certain restorations, right? And then Paul, again, he's continuing this theme: carry one another's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. He says, for if anyone considers himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Let each person examine his own work, and then he can take pride in himself alone and not compare himself with someone else, for each person will have to carry his own load. So it's interesting because, in again, just a few short verses, on one hand, he's talking about carrying one another's burdens, and then on another hand, he says each person has to carry their own load. And so that's another, important caveat or distinction to make, is that, there is a difference, right? Carrying one another's burdens doesn't mean that there aren't responsibilities that every individual has, right? And so that's kind of the other side of this whole conversation, is that, we want to be a community that has a healthy interdependence on one another, right? But the flip side of that is we don't want to veer into codependency, right? Where, for some people, on the outside, it looks like they're carrying one another's burdens, but actually when you dig a little deeper, it turns out that they have this, codependent, this need to be needed, or this need to be someone else's Messiah, or this need to, be that person, right? And so that, as biblical as that is, to carry one another's burdens, it has a dark side, right? And we can take it too far into the other extreme. And so there is an aspect where each person has their own responsibility before the Lord. They have their own load to bear. And so we don't want to step in and, carry that for them, because then that can get to a place of codependency, and it can actually be enabling, bad behavior or laziness or sin or whatever it is. And so we don't want to do that. We don't want to, help people to the degree that we're enabling bad habits or bad behavior. But the flip side is we don't want to just be this community where it's just a free for all. Everyone's on your own. If you, it's survival of the fittest. If you make it, great. If not, too bad, right? Like, we don't want to go to that extreme either. And so again, this is, and Paul doesn't like spell it out super specifically, and I don't think he should, because it's something where I think every community has to wrestle and figure out, what does it look like to, on the one hand, have each person carry their own load, but on the other hand, um, carry one another's burdens, and so what are the kinds of situations where the church should get involved and should add support, and where are the situations where they shouldn't, right? And in some of his other letters, Paul gives, specific examples of that to specific situations, um, for one example of that is like, I think, you can see clearly in the writings of the New Testament and Paul that, one of the big ministries of the early church was supporting widows, right? But then Paul, at a certain point needed to clarify, because he said, if the widow's under a certain age, they're still young enough where they can work, or they can, or they have family that they can rely on, or they can get remarried, like there's options for that person. So maybe the church doesn't need to be, materially supporting a person in that situation, but really we should be focusing that attention on people who have literally, they're too old, or they're past a certain age, they have no one left to rely on. Maybe the church should focus on supporting those people, but the ones that are younger, that still have, family that can support them, maybe maybe the church shouldn't be, helping them out. And so you get what I'm saying. There's wisdom that communities have to apply to specific situations. But again, the big idea is that the church should be a place, again, where those who have fallen can be restored. Obviously, that person has to want that help, right? Like you can't restore someone who doesn't want to be restored. And I've definitely heard of situations like that as well. So again, there's lots of caveats we can issue. But again, the big idea is that the spirit-filled community, the gospel-centered community, is a one that is able to restore. And I love also, he says, it's any wrongdoing. We should be known as those who are able to restore someone who's fallen into any wrongdoing, not just certain ones that are more palatable to us or more acceptable to us. We should, again, any wrongdoing. And we should also be, another big idea, we should be a community that is carrying one another's burdens, but in a healthy, interdependent way, not in a codependent way, and not in a way that negates the reality also that each person has to carry their own load. And so, there's so much to chew on here. But again, this is a picture, and it's just one example. There's other examples that Paul doesn't get into in this chapter, but this is a picture. This is an example of what the spirit-filled community looks like. And again, we cannot do this in our own strength. We do this because he has restored us, right? We do this because he rescued us when we were overtaken in wrongdoing, right? And we carry one another's burdens because he carried our burdens, right? Like he did nothing wrong. He had no sin in him, but yet he didn't just say, not my problem and walk away or ignore it. He chose to get involved. And again, I'm not saying everybody can get involved in everything. That's, again, fast track to burnout, right? Like, but we can't use that at the same time as an excuse to never get involved, right? And so we have to be, wise. Obviously, we have to be led by the Spirit, of course, but we should be willing to get involved. We should be willing because that's what Jesus did. And again, Paul says, when we carry one another's burdens, we fulfill the law of Christ. And so, again, this is a lot to chew on, I'm sure. I know that any community I've been a part of that sought to faithfully live out the gospel had to wrestle with this. And so, whether you're a pastor, a leader, or just a Christian, just trying to be faithful, to the Lord, you are going to have to wrestle with this. What does it look like to carry another's burden for, what does it look like to restore someone who's overtaken in wrongdoing? And my hope, my prayer is that we will all do our part, do the part that the Lord has given to us. And I think when we all arise and do that together, then we really do become the church. We really do become the light of the world. And so I hope that this episode has blessed you. I hope it's challenged you. And I pray that we would all arise to fulfill that calling, to be that people. So God bless you. We'll see you next time.